Thanks everybody for joining us, David and Dana and Claire. We welcome you to the Waterfront Law Team webinar, How to Build a Pier in Virginia. We have just a few housekeeping items as quick reminders before we get started. If you could mute your camera on your laptop as well as your cell phone just to be safe. If you have any questions during the duration of the webinar, feel free to drop them in the chat function. Otherwise, you can hold on to those questions and we've allotted for time at the end for Q&A. And then just wanted to remind you, we will be recording this webinar as well. So if you have to leave early or you wanted to have access to the presentation, all will be available hopefully by the middle to end of next week. And with that, I wanted to welcome everyone and introduce our two hosts. First off, we have Jim Lang. He is a shareholder and former COO of the law firm Pender & Coward. Jim focuses his practice on protecting Virginians who live, work, and play on the water. Jim established the Waterfront Law Team at Pender & Coward, and he and 3 other attorneys routinely handle all aspects of riparian property rights law, maritime and admiralty law, and environmental law. And our other co-host is Joe Keffler. Joe is a partner in Colin Marine Construction, and he's the company's estimator. He graduated from Virginia Tech in 2018 with a dual degree in building construction and real estate. He now works closely with homeowners in the area to plan, price, and construct piers among waterfront structures. So with that, I wanted to welcome and turn it over to Jim and Joe.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Jim Lang, and I'm so lucky to have Joe Keffler here with us today. Joe's an expert in pier construction, which is what we're going to talk about today. Let me get a few legal issues out of the way, and then let's get over to the meat of Joe's presentation on constructing a pier. The slide in front of you runs through the topics we're going to cover today. You've probably had a chance to look at it, so I'm not going to read the bullet points to you. You might notice, though, that we try to deliver more than we advertised. I think in the invite that went out, I'm not sure that we told you we were going to cover pricing. I'm not sure that I told you we were going to cover pier maintenance and longevity. So by coming today, you're getting a little bit more than you bargained for. Start off with legal issues around pier construction. And so if you have a pier at your property, the kind of things that can create legal risk for you are if the pier is built in a way that doesn't match the approvals you got through the regulatory process, that can be a real problem for you. Even worse, building the pier without getting permits. And sometimes we run into cases where somebody had all the approvals to build their pier and then they modified it without getting the permits for the modifications. An example of that, a recent one, was a client who added a kayak rack and a floating dock to their pier. And it went under the radar for quite a long time, but eventually the regulatory agency, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, figured it out. And so that client ended up being forced to apply for an after-the-fact permit, which was granted, along with a fine of $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 to penalize them for having done the installation without getting the permits in the first place. Another thing that will create legal risk for you is if your pier is built outside of your riparian area, and you'll see parenthetically a reference to whether the bottom is owned by the state, because there is some privately owned bottom in Virginia. And I've got a slide that'll break that down in more detail a little bit later on. Another one is inaccurate information fed into the approval process. We had a case in the last year and a half, where a client came to us. They didn't like the pier that their neighbor was installing, but all the approvals had been granted. And we dug into the application and we found that there was inaccurate information about the bottom topography. And when we brought that to the attention of the regulatory agencies, they revoked their permits, with the result that that person whose pilings had already been installed and they were getting ready on the construction process to install the headers and the stringers before the decking would go on, they had to pull all those pilings out and essentially start over again. Another area of legal risk is if your pier is going to interfere with navigation. That's always a concern. And during the approval process, that'll all get flushed out at that time. Now, one of the things that, and our firm represents sometimes people who are wanting to build a pier, and other times we're representing a person who objects to the pier going in next door. And when people object to a pier, very often the biggest reason is they paid a lot of money to live on the water. They have a beautiful view of the water, and when this pier goes in, it's going to block their view. We hear that repeatedly. And I would tell you that during the pier approval process, the complaint that it's going to interfere with the view of the water is not something that you're going to get very much traction on, both in the approval process, nor will you have much success with that legally. But let me talk to you for a minute about how somebody who owns a pier or is building a pier, how do they get caught up in the legal process? Well, the agency, the VMRC in this case, but other agencies as well, they have the ability to issue an order to the violator. So like, for example, a person who builds a pier that's outside of their riparian area, the agency has the ability to issue an order to make you modify that. The agencies can impose fines on violators. The agency can even sue a violator. And in many instances, another person can bring a lawsuit to deal with a pier next door that has been improperly installed or violates some of the things I've shared with you on the last slide. And then another area of potential use of the courts comes up in the situation where somebody, say, wants to build a pier and they cannot get an approval. The agency won't give the approvals for it, and you think the agency's decision-making is flawed. There is the ability.
Just turn the camera off.
Need you to mute, please. We're picking up some background noise. Still picking up background noise. If you could mute, please. Thank you. Another way that you can get into court is if you think the agency's decision-making was bad and you would like a court to review that decision-making and with a view towards getting the court to reverse it, there are avenues to do that. And our firm is very familiar with all of those techniques.
I had a busy day yesterday with that truck.
Still getting background noise. If you could mute, please.
I got a call from the fire marshal. They said
still getting background noise. If you could mute, please.
Gallons of diesel is on fire. I'm watching it run into the storm drain. On fire.
The person who's talking about the fire from the diesel fuel, if you could mute, please. We're picking up background noise.
And then the VDOT stormwater facility. So it didn't enter Newport News. Based on their problem.
Keith Allen, if you could mute, please, it'd be helpful. We're picking up background noise from you, Keith. Keith Allen, if you could please mute.
That truck burned up.
Keith Allen, if you could please mute. Keith Allen, please mute. All right, the joint permit application. That's how you get your pier project started. You're going to need to get a pier designer who will help you with your design, and then we'll prepare the joint permit application for you and then submit it to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, which it performs a great service by acting as a clearinghouse. And the reason you need a clearinghouse is multiple approvals to build a pier, some from federal agencies, some from state agencies, some from local agencies. And so rather than putting the person who's trying to build a pier to the task of making individual submissions to a variety of different agencies that many of them have never heard of, the VMRC is the central point. The word joint in joint permit application, that word joint has significance because it signifies that by submitting the application to the VMRC, it will jointly go out to all of the places that it needs to go. And we're going to dig into that in a minute. But I will tell you that one of the things the VMRC is going to do is they're going to contact the adjacent property owners, that's your neighbors, and they're going to share with them that you plan to build a pier, and they're going to ask that neighbor to let the VMRC know whether the neighbor agrees that the pier going in is a good idea or whether the neighbor objects. And so if you have somebody who's worried about their view, they're going to object. Or somebody who's worried about if that pier goes in, then they can't get in and out of their pier the way they want to, it interferes with navigation, they're going to object. And so that can be part of the process that you deal with during the approval process. Okay, I mentioned early on about some of the bottom land being privately owned in Virginia and some being state owned. If you're dealing with a lake or a pond or a man-made canal, it will always be privately owned bottom in the state of Virginia. If you're instead dealing with a bay or a river, creek, shore of the sea, chances are it will be state owned, although there are some carve outs for those situations where that bottom land was conveyed into private ownership prior to the American Revolution. And so the deed through which that conveyance was made is called a King's Grant. You live in Virginia Beach, you've probably seen the King's Grant neighborhood. Well, that's where that name, not that that area was granted by the king necessarily, but the King's Grant refers to that whole concept. And the reason that privately owned or state-owned matters is because if you're privately owned, you're going to need one less permit than you will need if you're on state-owned water. If it's privately owned bottom, yes, you're going to have deal with wetlands compliance. You're going to have to deal with the Army Corps of Engineers over navigability. Yes, you're going to need a building permit from the locality. And it's in a few cases, a few rare cases, you might have the Department of Environmental Quality getting involved or the Department of Historic Resources, but that's unusual. But that's it for permits on a privately owned bottom. But if you're on state-owned bottom, in addition to the wetlands and the navigability and the building permit and such, you're going to, in addition, need a permit from the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, because if you're on state-owned bottom, you need permission from the owner of that property to put a pier on that person's property, in this case, the state. And the VMRC acts as the landlord, if you will, for the state of Virginia with respect to all that state-owned bottom. And they're going to either, you're either going to get your permit, or in some instances, in fact, many instances, they'll give you a no permit needed letter. And the reason for the no permit needed letter is if your pier, in the Virginia Code, there is a description of width and and size of your pier, that if your pier is designed to fit within those parameters, then the state of Virginia has decided you don't need a permit from the VMRC. And it's called statutorily authorized, and you still have to submit your joint permit application, but what you'll get back from the VMRC is a letter from them that says you don't need a permit from us. That's the no permit needed letter, because your design fits within the characteristics that were put into the Virginia Code. You'll still need all the other permits you need for a privately owned bottom, but you won't need, but in addition, you'll need either the permit from the VMRC or a no permit needed letter. And I think that wraps up the legal side of this, and let's get over to Joe so he can tell us the nuts and bolts of actually getting your pier built. So Joe, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so finding a reputable pier designer is the job of what we call permit agents. There's a handful of them that we work with very frequently as a contractor in the Virginia Beach area. And their job is very important because, like Jim mentioned, it's difficult to make changes to your pier design once you have started the JPA process. So it's important to work with these permit agents to talk about what shape you want the pier, how big you want it to be. Do you want a floating dock? Do you want a boat lift? Get it all ironed out, get it all drawn so that once it's submitted, you don't have to worry about making changes down the road. These permit agents, like any other contractor, I think it's important to figure out their experience before you hire one. The vast majority of the people we personally work with have a ton of experience. Most of them have been doing it for 10, 20, even 30 years and have drawn hundreds, if not thousands, of pier structures in the Tidewater area. And then again, like other contractors, feel free to use word of mouth. Ask your neighbors. You know, if you live in a neighborhood that has a lot of waterfront homes, chances are you'll be able to talk to someone who recently had an experience with one of these permit agents, and feel free to get their advice and their take on each individual before hiring one yourself. And then to give you a few that we frequently work with that do a very good job, I would say David Butler with Gallup Surveyors, Richard Calvert with Calvert Marine, Bob and his son John Simon with Waterfront Consulting, and then David Kledzik with Marine Engineering. You'd be in good hands with either of the four. Moving into finding a reputable pier construction contractor, it's really important, first off, to make sure they have the correct class, city and state contractor's license. This is easy enough to do on your own. You can go on DPOR's website and search the contractor to make sure that their license is correct and in good standing. But it's also important to make sure they have the right class. You know, be a Class C license, you need to do $1,000 in work, $1,000 individual project in work. A Class B, you need to do any project over $10,000, and then a Class A for any project over $120,000. So you should obviously know what kind of price range you're in, and then make sure that your contractor is capable of performing the work legally. Next would be insurance. So their certificate of insurance should be able to list their marine liability, their workers' compensation, and then their U.S. longshore and harbor workers coverage. A lot of contractors in the area will try to get into marine construction using their existing liability insurance that covers other types of construction, like roofing or residential home building. And it's important to keep yourself, risk adverse to make sure that your contractor has the correct coverage. And then again, like the permit agents, do your own due diligence to select a contractor. Reach out to your neighbors, look at other pier projects in your neighborhood and figure out what contractors built them to figure out who you want to work with. And then it's important also to ask the contractor about their previous projects. Anyone who's doing good work in the area would be happy to let you tour one of their previous projects, or at least show you pictures of projects they've built in the past. For the pier construction process, so the first part, starting with the permit engineers, permit agents, is the design and the layout. And then the addition or lack of boat lifts, boat houses, floating docks, and other waterfront structures. And then you can start to lean on the contractors for materials and more finish items. But before any of the work starts, you need to make sure that your contractor has picked up and posted the building permit. This is easy enough for any contractor to do once the JPA application is fully approved. Then order of operations for construction are the mobilization of materials and equipment, the installation of piles, as you can see in the picture. Typically, we drive all of the piles for the pier structure first before continuing on. And then in this picture, you can see we've put up the headers and stringers or pier framing. And then we follow that with the decking. And then after all of the decking's down, we typically do other accessories like rub rail and cleats and pile cones and pile caps, boat lifts, and other just more aesthetic options that don't need to be included in the pier design or in the permit process. For pier pricing, there's several main cost drivers. First one is construction access. How difficult or easy is it to get into your backyard or get to your water off of your waterfront for your home with materials and with construction equipment. And then, of course, the overall size of the pier. So obviously, a 20-foot pier is going to cost less than a 100-foot pier. And then additional waterfront structures. So again, boat lifts, boathouses, floating docks. And then another big cost driver is decking material. We build a lot of new piers with PVC decking, like a Wolf or Trex brand material that is considerably more expensive than typical ground contact pine, which again is a great material that we build plenty of piers with. It's just, it can create quite a cost difference. So a couple examples of that are this pier you can see is very basic. It's only about 5 feet wide by 25 feet in total length, and it has pine decking. So something like this, you're looking at about $10,000. You know, you don't have a boat lift, you don't have a boathouse. It's very bare bones, but it serves its purpose. You know, if you're looking for a pier structure to hang out on in the evenings over the water or fish a little bit, this will get the job done. This pier here, you can see that if they would have just continued that 5 foot wide structure across the top of the pier, it would have ended up being a pine decked pier, 5 feet wide by about 35 feet long. In which case it would have only cost about $15,000. But this homeowner opted to build this U-shaped pier structure with 2 boat lifts sitting inside of the slip, along with a floating dock, which you can see has drastically increased the price of the project. And then a third example, you can see this pier was over 350 feet long. They have a boat house. They have a boat lift inside of the boathouse and 2 jet ski lifts you can see just to the right of the boathouse. And they also went for the Wolf PVC decking, which, you know, especially at that length, those cost drivers had made this project considerably more expensive than the previous 2. And then pier maintenance and longevity. A couple of things we see happen all the time with plumbing, and especially plumbing, but also power, is that people will leave water in their water lines, and come February, December, February, January, you'll crack the plumbing PVC when the water in the pipe freezes. And so we see people working on that all the time. And then with power, you know, if we have a hurricane, if we have these big nor'easters, every pier at some point in time will go all the way underwater. And if your power and electrical wiring is not up to snuff, there's often a lot of damage with that that requires maintenance and repairs as well. With pine decking, with how salty and harsh the weather is here, we really only see about 10 years of life out of typical pine decking. You can extend that with stains and paint. But then you have to keep restaining and repainting, which is some of the maintenance involved there. Then with your synthetics, your PVC decking, much longer lasting, but also worth pressure washing every once in a while just to get mildew and other buildup off of it. There's much more maintenance involved with boat lifts. Like anything else mechanical, it's important to run them frequently, or else the salt water and that corrosion and electrolysis will continue to seize things up with the motors and pulley wheels over time. And in that same vein, it's important to grease. You know, there's Zerk fittings and a handful of different locations on every boat lift. And so every 6 or 8 months, it's important to make sure that everything's greased correctly so that it'll run. But like I alluded to a little bit, any pier structure is at the mercy of acts of God. You know, if a Cat 5 hurricane comes right up the mouth of the bay, there's no telling what damage you could incur. And all of the water around here is extremely salty, being right inside the mouth of the bay. And so everything just gets eaten and corroded by the salt water over time. So we see, you know, timber built pier structures in this area really only last about 40, maybe 50 years if built especially well. And that's just the nature of things and living on the water in Virginia Beach.
Oh, we've come to additional resources. I'll just leave that up on the screen for a minute. And Joe, I'm curious, if you go with the synthetic decking material, that's going to have a longer life than the pine decking material. But you still have the framing was perhaps done by wood, and then you also have the pilings that are wood, and those are going to deteriorate probably faster than that synthetic decking. How does a person manage maintenance when you've got different parts of the pier weathering at different paces, different speeds?
Sure. The important thing to note is that the piles and the subframing is a marine treated lumber.
Mm.
So that's all 2.5 CCA. And you can't get pine decking. It is all pine. It's all the same material. It's about the treatment. But the decking you can't get in that 2.5 marine treatment because it has to be rated for skin contact.
I see.
So you can get a nasty splinter and an infection from the marine treated stuff. So what you're walking on a lot of the times barefoot, you wouldn't want to be that marine treatment. So the marine treated lumber with the piles, you can expect to get that 40-year longevity out of, whereas the decking being only ground contact treated is always the first thing to go.
Gotcha. Okay, so additional resources up here. Joe's firm, Colin Marine Construction, their website is listed right up top. And then we've given you a place where you can go to the VMRC website if you want to learn more about the permitting process. And then several articles that are on my blog, either dealing with building a pier or establishing a riparian area, which is important because that's where your pier is supposed to be within your riparian area. And then I've got an article on King's grants, all of those on my waterfrontpropertylaw.com website. And with that, we're ready for your questions. And you can see the contact information for Joe over on the right, both his phone number and his email, and my contact information on the left. And let me leave it there. And Abigail asked if you could tell us whether we've got any questions that we're looking to answer for folks.
We'll give folks a chance to drop them in the chat function, but we did have a few that came in prior to the event. The first one looks like it might be for Joe. It's, do I have to wait until my plans are approved to hire a construction contractor?
That's a good question. You do not. Any good contractor will take your ideas and be able to develop a preliminary proposal based off of what you might want even before you have drawings. You know, typically you can look at what your neighbors have and decide that you want something very similar and get a contractor involved to get a price reference so you know what you're looking at. And in that same vein, it's important not to wait until your permit is completely approved, because a lot of contractors, especially the ones that do good work, are in high demand and often book new work out 8, 10, 12 months in advance. So you'd want to get numbers from reputable contractors and get a frame of reference for their timeline to make sure that once your permit's approved, you know, you don't have to wait that entire 10 or 12 months after the approval. You know, hopefully you're waiting more like, you know, 5 or 6 months to get your work done.
Okay. It looks like our friend Vince just submitted a question on the chat. What maintenance can be done without a new permit, and what maintenance requires a permit?
So this question could be best answered by one of the permit agents. But the good rule of thumb that I've been told is that you should, if you're implementing new piles, you really should have a new permit. Even if you're replacing them in the exact same spot, you're supposed to have a permit in order to do so. If you have just a handful of framing members like headers or stringers that are broken, you can do that without a permit, assuming again that you're not expanding the footprint of what you already have. And then replacing the decking, as long as you're not doing a full scale replacement of all of your decking, you know, you're allowed to go out and swap out deck boards on your own without a permit as well.
Okay. One more question that came in on the chat, I think from Dana. How often is a MESO needed for in-water work for these types of projects? MESO is MESO?
I'm not sure what that means.
I'm not sure what a
Sorry.
MESO is either.
Dana, do you want to elaborate on your question?
Yeah. So I'm federally certified marine endangered species observer, and I've done plenty of marine endangered species observations for quote unquote in water work. And that does include pier construction. And I just wanted to know, how often does this come up in the permitting process, or how often does this come up, especially since over the past several years, we have been seeing an influx of sightings of a lot of endangered species or marine protected species, like the West Indies manatee that have been seen in Rudy Inlet over the past several years. So just wondering how often that shows up.
Joe, I don't know if you've had that come up in any of your projects. I've done some endangered species work, but have you had it come up in any of your projects?
Not so. We're vastly residential company. And the permit agents I listed off, they're all residential permit agents. I have not seen anything about those endangered species issues at the residential level. At the commercial level, I'm sure it's more involved.
So Dana, I can tell you that in the permit process, there are federal agencies involved, principally the Army Corps of Engineers, because of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. And anytime a federal agency is going to issue a permit, they have to ask the question, do we have any threatened or endangered species in the area where the project is going to take place? And if the answer to that is yes, then there's steps that they have to initiate with the appropriate resource agency. So for example, the West Indian manatee, that would come under the National Marine Fisheries Service. On the other hand, if it was, I don't know, a red cockaded woodpecker, that would come under the Fish and Wildlife Service. In any event, once they have the data and they have to look for the data, they have to go ask the question, do a survey. And if they have threatened or endangered species that are in the vicinity of the project, they have to sort it into which resource agency do we talk to, National Marine Fisheries or Fish and Wildlife. And they undertake what's called a consultation. And out of that consultation will come requirements for the project to be carried out in a way that doesn't create a take of the protected animal, or it may allow takes if they're unavoidable and in the judgment of the resource agency, the activity, even though it might cause some harm to the animals, the harm isn't a big enough harm given the population of the animals and other factors that it can't just be absorbed by the ecosystem. And so what would get you involved then as an endangered species observer would be if the project crossed the tripwires I just described and the resource agencies impose the kind of conditions, sometimes they're time of year restrictions. Other times it might be that you just have to have a person like you, Dana, on site so that if the endangered animal shows up, steps can be taken to not have the prohibited contact. But I have not seen it come up on any of the peer projects that we've worked on here at my law firm, and we've worked on, well north of 100 of them over the last 2 or 3 years. And I've never seen that come up in any of the projects that we've had. Does that answer your question, Dana?
Oh yes, for sure. Certainly. Yeah. It seems like it does hit a lot of the commercial side versus more so residential. So I just.
Yeah. And also just to be complete, it's not just animals that are protected by the Endangered Species Act, but it's certain plants as well. If they are in very short supply and at risk of extinction, they'll be put on either the threatened list or the endangered list, and then these protections would kick in. But again, I have not seen it on any of the peer projects here in Hampton Roads. Any other questions for us, Abigail?
One more through the chat came in from David Pryor. How does dredging impact the permit process?
From what I understand, you typically need a totally separate permit for dredging than you do from your residential pier permit.
And that's absolutely right. And for your dredging project, you're going to be dealing again with the Army Corps of Engineers. This time, not so much under their authority under the Rivers and Harbors Act, but instead their authority under the Clean Water Act to regulate fill being placed in the waters of the United States. So totally separate permit, but kind of goes hand in hand because you want your pier to get you to deep water. And one way to get deep water is to dredge to increase the bottom depth. The other way to get to deep water is to pier out over the shallows to reach the deep water. So you're kind of put to that choice. And most people, if they're looking at the cost of getting their pier installed, permitted and installed as compared to the cost to get dredging done, most people are going to find that that piering out is by far the cheaper option, if that is an option given the situation you're in. Some places you can't pier out because the water's shallow, no matter how far you go out, and then dredging is your only option. But you're gonna, when you look at the money that's involved and the time that's involved in getting the permits, much easier to get your pier permits than to get a dredging permit. And I have, by the way, I have on my website a webinar on dredging that we did, a year, I want to say like in September of 2022. So if you go to my website, David, you'll find a webinar like this one that covers dredging, including the costs involved. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that.
Okay, great. It looks like Vince was asking about that one. I have just one more question that had come in previous, and while we have Joe with us, I think this is one more for Joe. We could wrap with this one. How long does it take to build a pier?
So like the first smaller pier structure I showed you, something like that will really only take about a week to install. And then like Jim was talking about, if you have to build, that longer 350-foot pier we built was to get to deeper water. You can see in that picture, it kind of goes over some shallower islands. But a project like that can take up to 2 months, again, especially if you're adding boat lifts and boat houses and floating docks and additional structures. We've never done a project that took more than 3 months, but that answers that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, before we wrap up, I just want to say how much I appreciate you, Joe, coming and working with us today on this. Your knowledge on the topic was super helpful, very practical, and I think it's going to be very useful for the people who are sitting in. So thank you for helping us with this today.
Of course, thank you.